In the year 530 BC, on the eastern fringes of the known world, the greatest conqueror humanity had ever seen met a fate so shocking that ancient writers struggled to describe it without fear. Cyrus Roman II of Persia, remembered by history as Cyrus the Great, the man who had shattered kingdoms, humbled empires, and carved the largest empire the world had ever known, marched into the lands beyond the Oxus River believing victory was inevitable. He had crushed Media, absorbed Lydia, taken Babylon without burning its temples, and ruled from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. Kings bowed when his banners appeared. Cities opened their gates without resistance. Yet this time, Cyrus was not facing a king. He was facing a queen. Her name was Tomyris. The Massagetae lands stretched across the harsh steppes of Central Asia, a world of wind, grass, and blood-soaked earth. It was a place where survival itself was a daily war, and where rulers were forged by brutality rather than courtly etiquette. Tomyris ruled not from marble halls but from the saddle of a horse. She was queen by strength, not ceremony. And when Cyrus sent messengers demanding submission, she answered him not with diplomacy, but with warning. Ancient sources agree that Cyrus underestimated her. He had conquered men who wore crowns of gold and governed through parchment and seals. Tomyris governed warriors who measured loyalty in scars. Cyrus, confident in his reputation and his army, decided to bring the Massagetae under Persian control. It was not greed alone that drove him. Control of the eastern steppe meant securing trade routes, eliminating a persistent military threat, and extending Persian dominance beyond any empire before it. From Cyrus's perspective, this was simply another campaign. From Tomyris's perspective, it was an invasion that demanded annihilation. Before armies clashed, Cyrus attempted deception. According to Herodotus, he devised a trap meant to exploit what he believed was the enemy's weakness. He ordered a camp stocked with wine, rich foods, and luxury supplies to be left behind as his forces withdrew. The Massagetae were known for drinking fermented mare's milk, not wine. Cyrus believed intoxication would break their discipline. When a contingent of Massagetae warriors, led by Tomyris's son Spargipizes, discovered the abandoned camp, they fell into the trap, they feasted, they drank. Persian troops returned and slaughtered them. Spargipizes was captured alive. When Tomyris learned what had happened, she did not plead. She did not negotiate from fear. She sent a message to Cyrus that echoed through history. She accused him of treachery, not valor. She demanded the return of her son and warned him to leave her lands. If he refused, she vowed to give him more blood than he could ever drink. Cyrus ignored the warning. Spargipizes, humiliated by capture, took his own life. And with that death, diplomacy ended. What followed was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a massacre shaped by rage, grief, and cold determination. The armies met in open combat somewhere near the Jaxartes River. Herodotus describes it as the fiercest battle fought by any barbarian people against a civilized empire. Persian discipline clashed with steppe ferocity. Archers filled the sky with arrows. Cavalry smashed into infantry lines. For hours, neither side yielded. Then the Massagetae broke through. Persian formations collapsed under relentless assault. Cyrus himself was killed in the fighting. What happened next transformed the event from military defeat into legend. Tomyris ordered that Cyrus's body be found. When it was brought before her, she did not allow mourning or respect. She ordered a wineskin to be filled with blood, and, according to ancient tradition, plunged Cyrus's severed head into it. Her words, preserved by historians, were not triumphant boasts but condemnation. She declared that she had warned him. He had ignored her. Now she had given him the blood he had thirsted for. The death of Cyrus the Great in 530 BC sent shockwaves across the ancient world. No emperor of his stature had ever fallen so completely at the hands of a foreign ruler, let alone a woman ruling a so-called barbarian people. Persian expansion halted abruptly in the east. The myth of invincibility shattered. Later, Persian kings would rule vast lands. but none would carry the same aura of unstoppable destiny. Tomyris did not build an empire from the victory. She did not march west to claim Persian cities. Her objective was never conquest. It was survival, justice, and revenge. By defeating Cyrus, she preserved the independence of her people and delivered one of the most devastating symbolic defeats in world history. This moment mattered far beyond the battlefield. It challenged ancient assumptions about power, gender, and empire. Greek writers, accustomed to portraying Eastern rulers as despots and women as passive figures, struggled to reconcile Tomyris with their worldview. Yet they recorded her story because it could not be ignored. The greatest emperor of the age had fallen, and his conqueror was a queen who ruled without apology. The legacy of that battle shaped how empires approached the steppe for centuries. Later conquerors, from Darius to Alexander, approached Central Asia with caution, haunted by the memory of Cyrus's end. Tomyris became a symbol of resistance against imperial overreach, a reminder that conquest has limits, and that even the most powerful rulers can fall when arrogance blinds them. This was not merely the death of a king. It was the moment the world learned that empire, no matter how vast, could be humbled by a ruler who refused to bow. The shock of Cyrus the Great's death did not fade with the dust of the battlefield. In the weeks that followed the battle of 530 BCE, messengers carried the news across the Persian Empire, and everywhere it reached, disbelief followed. Cyrus was not merely a king. He was the architect of an imperial idea. His rule had been unusually tolerant for its age, marked by policies that allowed conquered peoples to retain their customs, religions, and local governance. Babylon had fallen to him without destruction. Jewish exiles had been allowed to return home. Even his enemies often respected him. That such a man could be destroyed so completely by a foreign queen in a distant land struck at the psychological foundations of Persian power. For the Persians, the loss was both personal and political. Cyrus had no equal successor ready to step seamlessly into his place. His death exposed the vulnerability of a system built around one extraordinary individual. Cambyses Roman II, his son, would inherit the throne, but he inherited it already wounded. The empire remained vast, but the illusion of invincibility was gone. In court circles and military councils, the question was whispered but rarely spoken aloud. If Cyrus could fall, who was truly safe? For Tomyris, the aftermath was quieter, but no less consequential. She did not pursue Persian territory or claim spoils beyond what was necessary. Ancient sources emphasize her restraint after victory, a detail that separates her from many conquerors of the era. Her goal had never been empire. It had been defense, justice, and the destruction of a threat that endangered her people's way of life. Once that threat was neutralized, she withdrew her forces and returned to rule the Massagetae. Yet her restraint did not diminish the terror her name inspired. Across the ancient world, Tomyris became a figure of both admiration and fear. To nomadic cultures, she represented the ultimate warrior queen, one who defended her people with intelligence and ferocity. To imperial powers she was a warning. The steppe was not empty land waiting to be claimed. It was defended by leaders capable of destroying even the greatest armies. Greek historians played a critical role in shaping how Tomyris was remembered. Herodotus, writing decades later, presented a story with a mixture of fascination and unease. His account emphasizes her moral authority as much as her brutality. Cyrus, for all his greatness, is portrayed as the one who crosses ethical boundaries through deception. Tomyris, though ruthless, is shown as acting within a code of honor shaped by her culture. This contrast mattered deeply to Greek audiences, who were accustomed to viewing the Persian Empire as the ultimate expression of Eastern power. Tomyris inverted that narrative. The symbolism of Cyrus's death resonated far beyond Persia and the Greek world. In later centuries, Roman writers would reference the story as an example of imperial overconfidence. Medieval chroniclers would reinterpret Tomyris as a cautionary figure, sometimes exaggerating her savagery, other times celebrating her justice. Renaissance artists painted her holding the head of Cyrus, transforming history into allegory. Each retelling reinforced the same core lesson. Unchecked ambition invites catastrophe. What made Tomyris particularly unsettling to later societies was that she did not fit easily into familiar categories. She was not a passive victim resisting conquest, nor was she an empire builder seeking glory. She was a ruler who understood power as something to be used decisively and then set aside. Her ruthlessness was not constant violence but controlled destruction, unleashed only when all warnings were ignored. This distinction made her difficult to dismiss as a mere barbarian queen. In strategic terms, the defeat of Cyrus altered the trajectory of Persian expansion. The eastern frontier became a zone of caution rather than conquest. While later Persian kings would campaign in Central Asia, none approached the region with the same confidence or ambition as Cyrus had. The empire's focus shifted westward, toward Egypt and the Aegean world, where enemies were more familiar and terrain more predictable. The steppe, haunted by the memory of Cyrus's end, remained a place of danger. Cambyses' Roman II, burdened by the legacy of his father, sought to reassert Persian dominance elsewhere. His invasion of Egypt was successful, but his reign was marked by instability, cruelty, and paranoia. Some ancient writers suggest that the psychological impact of Cyrus's death weighed heavily on him, shaping a harsher style of rule. Whether or not this interpretation is fully accurate, the contrast between father and son was stark. Cyrus had ruled through respect and vision. Cambyses ruled through fear. Tomyris, meanwhile, continued to rule among her people, though historical records grow sparse. Nomadic societies left fewer written traces, and much of what we know comes from external observers. Yet the silence itself speaks to the nature of her victory. She did not seek to memorialize herself through monuments or inscriptions. Her legacy was preserved through memory and warning rather than stone. The cultural implications of her victory were profound. In a world where female rulers were rare and often contested, Tomyris stood as undeniable proof that leadership was not confined to one gender or one civilization. She commanded armies, made strategic decisions, and defeated the most powerful ruler of her age. Later societies, uncomfortable with this reality, often reframed her story to emphasize her cruelty rather than her competence. By focusing on the image of Cyrus's head in blood, they avoided confronting the full significance of her achievement. Yet that image endured precisely because it captured the emotional truth of the conflict. Cyrus had sought domination through deception and force. Tomyris responded with absolute finality. The act was not merely revenge for her son, though that grief burned deeply. It was a declaration that her people would never be subdued, no matter the cost. World history is often told through the rise and fall of empires, but moments like this reveal a deeper pattern. Empires expand until they encounter resistance that refuses to negotiate on imperial terms. Tomyris represented such resistance. She did not bargain for autonomy within Cyrus's system. She rejected the system itself. In doing so, she exposed the limits of imperial power. This confrontation mattered because it challenged the narrative of inevitable conquest. Cyrus's empire was vast, sophisticated, and well organized. Yet it could still be undone by a leader who understood her terrain, her people, and the psychology of her enemy better than he understood her. The lesson was not lost on later rulers. Even Alexander the Great, centuries later, would approach Central Asia with caution, aware that brilliance alone did not guarantee victory. The story of Tomyris and Cyrus endures because it speaks to universal themes: arrogance and humility, power and resistance, grief and justice. It is a reminder that history is not shaped solely by those who build empires, but also by those who stop them. In bringing down the greatest emperor of her age, Tomyris did more than win a battle. She rewrote the limits of power itself. As decades passed after the death of Cyrus the Great, the story of his fall hardened into legend, but its deeper consequences continued to shape the ancient world in ways that were not immediately visible. Empires do not collapse overnight from a single defeat, yet they are permanently altered by moments that expose their vulnerability. The confrontation between Tomyris and Cyrus became one such moment, a fracture line in the idea of absolute imperial destiny. It changed how power was understood, how borders were respected, and how resistance was remembered. Within the Persian Empire, official narratives carefully softened the humiliation. Royal inscriptions avoided mentioning Cyrus's death in detail, focusing instead on his achievements and divine favor. Persian ideology depended on the image of the king as chosen by the gods, upheld by cosmic order. A ruler cut down by a foreign queen on the edge of the world disrupted that ideology. Silence became a form of damage control. Yet among soldiers, administrators, and provincial leaders, the truth could not be erased. They knew that the empire's founder had died not peacefully, but violently far from home. This awareness subtly reshaped Persian military thinking. Campaigns became more calculated, diplomacy more cautious, especially when dealing with nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples. The steppe was no longer seen as merely uncivilized land awaiting order. It was recognized as a strategic environment where traditional imperial tactics could fail catastrophically. Mobility, local knowledge, and cultural misunderstanding could undo even the most disciplined army. Tomyris had demonstrated this brutally. Beyond Persia, the Greek world absorbed the story with fascination. For Greek writers, Cyrus was a paradoxical figure. He was an enemy of the Greek city-states, yet also admired for his discipline and governance. His defeat at the hands of Tomyris offered a narrative that satisfied both admiration and warning. It confirmed that even the most impressive Eastern monarchs were subject to downfall, while also reinforcing Greek anxieties about the unpredictable power of the so-called barbarian world beyond familiar borders. Over time, Tomyris herself became a symbolic figure rather than a fully understood ruler. Her image shifted depending on who was telling the story. To some, she was the embodiment of righteous vengeance, a mother avenging her son and defending her people. To others, she was portrayed as savage and excessive, defined primarily by the gruesome treatment of Cyrus's body. This selective emphasis reveals more about later societies than about Tomyris herself. They struggled to reconcile her effectiveness as a leader with their own expectations of power, order, and gender. In truth, Tomyris's ruthlessness was strategic, not impulsive. Her actions followed a clear logic shaped by the realities of her world. The Massagetae could not afford prolonged conflict with a vast empire. They could not retreat endlessly without losing their lands and identity. Cyrus's deception and the death of her son removed any remaining possibility of compromise. Total victory became the only path to survival. Her response, severe as it was, served its purpose. Persia did not return. This outcome highlights a crucial but often overlooked aspect of ancient warfare. Victory was not always measured by territorial expansion. Sometimes it was measured by deterrence. By killing Cyrus and making an unforgettable statement, Tomyris ensured that no future Persian ruler would lightly consider invading her lands. In this sense, her victory was not just immediate, but generational. The memory of Cyrus's defeat also influenced how later empires understood leadership. The idea that a ruler's personal ambition could endanger an entire state gained traction. Cyrus had been a brilliant strategist, but his confidence had hardened into certainty. He believed his experience guaranteed success, even in unfamiliar terrain against unfamiliar opponents. Tomyris exploited that certainty. She allowed him to believe he was in control until it was too late. This pattern would repeat throughout history. Empires that overextended themselves convinced of their own superiority, often fell to forces they dismissed as inferior or uncivilized. The story of Tomyris and Cyrus became an early example of this dynamic, echoed centuries later in Roman defeats, medieval collapses, and modern conflicts. Power, once assumed permanent, proved conditional. For women in positions of authority, Tomyris's legacy was particularly complex. Ancient sources did not deny her competence, but they often framed it as an exception, something unnatural or extraordinary. This framing allowed later societies to admire her while still maintaining restrictive norms, yet the historical reality remained unchanged. She ruled, she commanded, and she defeated the greatest emperor of her age. No reinterpretation could undo that fact. Her story also complicates the simplistic division between civilization and barbarism that dominates many ancient histories. Cyrus represented an organized, bureaucratic empire with written laws and monumental architecture. Tomyris represented a mobile society structured around kinship, warfare, and survival. The defeat of Cyrus demonstrated that organization alone did not guarantee superiority. Adaptability, cohesion, and leadership mattered just as much. As centuries passed, Tomyris faded from direct historical record, but not from cultural memory. Writers returned to her story whenever they needed an example of imperial arrogance punished. Artists depicted her as both queen and executioner, often exaggerating the violence to heighten the moral lesson. Philosophers used the story to debate justice and revenge. Was Tomyris cruel, or was she simply responding in kind to Cyrus's actions? The question remained open, which is why the story endured. The enduring power of the narrative lies in its moral ambiguity. Cyrus was not a tyrant in the conventional sense. He was widely respected, even by those he conquered. Tomyris was not a conqueror seeking domination. She was a defender responding to invasion. Neither figure fits neatly into the roles of hero or villain. Their clash reveals how history is shaped not by simple morality, but by competing visions of order. This complexity is what makes the event historically significant rather than merely sensational. The fall of Cyrus at the hands of Tomyris marked the moment when the greatest empire of the age confronted its limits. It showed that power based on expansion inevitably encounters resistance that cannot be absorbed or negotiated away. Sometimes that resistance takes the form of a ruler who refuses to submit, no matter the cost. By the end of the 6th century BC, the world had changed. Persia remained powerful, but it was no longer unchallenged in spirit. The idea of absolute dominance had been cracked. Somewhere beyond the empire's eastern horizon, the memory of Tomyris lingered as a warning carved not in stone, but in blood and memory. By the early 5th century BC, long after the blood of Cyrus the Great had dried into the soil of the eastern steppe, his empire still stood, but it stood changed. Persia remained vast, wealthy, and formidable, yet something essential had been lost with its founder. The idea that expansion was both destiny and divine right had been quietly damaged. This change did not announce itself through collapse or rebellion. It emerged slowly, in caution, in hesitation, and in memory. At the center of that memory stood the figure of Tomyris. What made her victory endure was not merely that she killed the greatest emperor of her age, but that she did so without attempting to replace him. History is filled with conquerors who defeated rivals only to become the next tyrant in line. Tomyris did not follow that pattern. She returned to her people. She ruled where she had always ruled. Her power was not validated by empire, but by survival. This distinction is why her story resisted absorption into imperial propaganda, and remained unsettling to later civilizations. For Persia, Cyrus's death became a lesson wrapped in silence. Cambyses Roman, too, never attempted to avenge his father in the east. His attention turned instead toward Egypt, a land that fit the Persian model of conquest more comfortably. Darius I, who followed, reorganized the empire with extraordinary efficiency, dividing it into satrapies and strengthening administrative control. Yet even Darius, one of history's most capable rulers, did not attempt to bring the Massagetae fully under Persian rule. The eastern frontier remained a boundary rather than a target. This restraint was not accidental. Persian leaders understood that Cyrus's death had revealed a kind of enemy empire could not easily defeat. Nomadic societies did not depend on cities that could be besieged or supply lines that could be cut. Their strength lay in mobility, cohesion, and intimate knowledge of terrain. Tomyris had used these advantages perfectly. By drawing Cyrus into unfamiliar conditions and refusing to fight on his terms, she turned imperial strength into vulnerability. The Greeks, observing Persia from the west, absorbed this lesson in their own way. To them, Cyrus was a symbol of Eastern monarchy, a ruler whose power dwarfed that of any Greek king. His defeat by Tomyris reinforced a belief that no single ruler, no matter how mighty, could dominate the world indefinitely. This idea fed into Greek political thought, particularly the suspicion of absolute monarchy. While the Greeks would later face Persia in their own wars, the image of Cyrus's fall lingered as proof that even the strongest empire could bleed. As time moved on, Tomyris's story was retold and reshaped to fit different moral frameworks. Roman authors, writing centuries later, often emphasized her severity, using her as an example of how excessive ambition invites violent correction. Medieval chroniclers, uncomfortable with a woman wielding such decisive power, sometimes transformed her into a symbol of uncontrolled vengeance. Renaissance artists romanticized the moment, focusing on dramatic imagery rather than political reality. Yet beneath these reinterpretations, the core truth remained intact. A queen who ruled a people dismissed as barbarians had defeated the most successful emperor of the ancient world. No amount of retelling could erase that fact. Instead, each generation grappled with it, reshaping the story to suit its fears and values. Modern historians approach Tomyris with greater caution, aware of the limitations of ancient sources. Herodotus, while invaluable, wrote from a Greek perspective and relied on oral accounts. Some details of the battle, including the exact manner of Cyrus's death, remain debated, yet the broad outline is accepted across scholarship. Cyrus died campaigning against the Massagetae. Tomyris ruled them. Persia withdrew. The symbolic weight of the event is undeniable, even if every detail cannot be proven with certainty. What matters most is not whether every word attributed to Tomyris was spoken exactly as recorded, but why the story took the form it did. Ancient societies do not preserve narratives without reason. The story of Tomyris survived because it answered a question that troubled every empire. What happens when power overreaches? The answer, delivered through her victory, was simple and terrifying. Power breaks. This is why Tomyris can be described as terrifyingly ruthless. Not because she delighted in cruelty, but because she understood that mercy toward an invader determined to dominate could mean extinction. Her ruthlessness was not constant violence. It was absolute finality. Once Cyrus crossed the line from diplomacy into deception, she removed every alternative except destruction. In doing so, she ensured the safety of her people and the permanence of her warning. Her story also forces a reassessment of how history measures greatness. Cyrus is remembered as great because he built. Tomyris is remembered because she stopped him. Both acts required intelligence, leadership, and vision. Yet history often favors builders over defenders. The clash between these two rulers exposes that bias. Without Tomyris, Cyrus's expansion might have continued unchecked. With her, the limits of empire were exposed. In world history, there are moments when expansion meets resistance that cannot be absorbed or erased. These moments define eras. The defeat of Cyrus by Tomyris was one such moment. It did not end the Persian Empire, but it reshaped its future. It did not create a new empire, but it preserved an old way of life. It did not produce monuments, but it produced memory. That memory endured because it carried a universal warning. No ruler, no matter how celebrated, is immune to consequence. No empire, no matter how vast, exists beyond the reach of those who refuse to submit. Tomyris did not conquer the world, but she changed it by reminding it that power is never absolute. In the end, the greatest emperor in history was brought down not by another empire, not by internal rebellion, but by a queen who understood her land, her people, and the cost of surrender. Her ruthlessness was not excess, it was necessity, and that is why her story still matters.